Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? Okay. So I'm very, very pleased to open this webinar. My name is Miki Motola, and I am the head of the Center of Contemplative Studies and Mindfulness in Oranim College. Some words of happening. We are all going through a challenging time and face our deepest fears, but also our responsibility in a new and intense way. Organizing this conference was a way for me to deal with this pandemic. I initiated this webinar to have an in-depth meeting on an issue that concerns all of us, meditation and spiritual quest in education and society. So I'm pleased to host you at the first web conference of the center. Thank you for joining us. It's really, really exciting to have people from all over the world just with us now. Since its beginning a couple of years ago, hundreds of students studied mindfulness in Oranim and enjoyed contemplative ways of learning and teaching. For the first time this year, we also held a course to train mindfulness facilitators to work in school with children and youth. The topic of the conference, how radical is mindfulness within a community context, emerged from my dialogue with the speakers in this conference. Oranim College is known for its social commitment, so it's no wonder that examining the complex relationship between mindfulness and social engagement is at the heart of our inquiry. The fact that mindfulness has become so popular is of course desirable on the one hand, but also a source of some discomfort. Therefore, I would like us to question in this conference, how can we maintain the subversive, radical nature of mindfulness meditation as it becomes a fashionable trend? Now I'm happy to introduce my partners for this journey. Dr. Stephen Fulder, has a doctorate in molecular biology and has published 14 books on outer and inner health. He is the founder and senior teacher of Tovana, the Israel's Insight Society. Has been teaching for 25 years, mostly in Israel, but also abroad, and has been deeply engaged in peace work in the Middle East. His recent books are What's Beyond Mindfulness, Waking Up to This Precious Life, and The 5 Powers, a guide to personal peace and freedom. Kelli Love is a leading educator and consultant in the mindfulness in education field. She has enjoyed 20 years as an educator in the roles of teacher, mentor, curriculum developer, and trainer. Currently, she is working in a school in the South Bronx, New York City. Amir Freiman is the author of the book Spiritual Transmission, Paradox and Dilemmas on the Spiritual Path, and currently writing a doctoral thesis on living transcendence, a phenomenological study of spiritual masters. The 2 lectures in the conference were pre-recorded for translation and subtitling in Hebrew for the sake of our Israeli participants. We will begin the conference with a lecture by Dr. Stephen Fulder. At the end of his lecture, we will pause for 2 minutes to have time, reflect, and send questions and comment in the chat. The questions and comments may be in English or Hebrew, and Amir Freiman will receive them and compile a list of the main questions. We will then continue with the second lecture with Kelli Love. Again, you are welcome to send your questions and comments by chat in English or Hebrew. Immediately after Kelli Love's lecture, Amir Freiman will lead a 40-minute session of questions and answers. We will end the webinar with a short meditation. As it is usually the case in webinar, there will be no video participation of the audience. Sorry. You are invited to write comments and questions in the chat during the webinar, and this will be passed on to the speaker, who will respond to them after the 2 lectures. I would like to thank, before we start, my friends from the IT department, Nir Nahum, Ishai Sonego, and Ronen Shipok and Irit Liberchuk for their support, and Maya Lapid and Daniel Motola for the graphics, and Daniel for the music as well. I wish us all an inspiring, thought-provoking, and significant event. Thank you very much. Now we'll continue with the lecture of Stephen Fulder.
So welcome. I'm Stephen Fulder. I've been teaching Dharma, Buddhist teachings, meditation, mindfulness for 25 years. And I've seen the amazing growth of mindfulness in the whole Western world, which has been quite an extraordinary phenomenon. And at the beginning, I was a little bit concerned about it from the point of view of its dilution and turned into something, a package which is rather minimal. But it is extraordinary that it's made such a change in medicine, in politics. Even 120 British members of parliament have gone through mindfulness courses. I don't know whether it did any good or not. But in education and, of course, psychology, it's been huge. However, there has been issues and problems, and it has arrived in the Western world rather diluted. It's arrived with a tendency to turn into a kind of feel-better technique, a bit like going to the gym, except it's a mental gym. In a more subtle place, and I would say social, political place, it has had a tendency a little bit like Soma in the book 1984 by, in which Soma is a kind of a pacifier of the masses to make sure they have a good time, they're relaxed, they're calm, and they don't make rebellion. And so it is, mindfulness has that problem that in a way it may be used to maintain the values, the consensus, and the problems that we face, rather than, in its original sense, something radical that makes change both in the person and in the world. And just a small example, in companies, mindfulness can be used just to make people feel a bit happier, but meanwhile the company is doing very unethical kind of bottom line activities which people are not reacting to. Same in the classroom. Classroom, kids can be getting up and saying, we want change, we want to look again at things, or mindfulness can be calm down, feel good, everything's okay. So in order to look at that more carefully, I think first thing we have to do is to undo the word mindfulness. Mindfulness has been talked about as a thing. It's not a thing. We can't just say it's a thing and then judge it. Instead of that, we have to ask, what is it really? How is it used correctly or incorrectly? What is the direction and purpose that people use it for? What's their intentions behind it? What is the cultural context that mindfulness is used? What's the pressures of the society and the consensus? For example, inside the classroom, the consensus and the pressure of the culture, which mindfulness then has to conform to. So it's a bit like saying, you know, judging mindfulness in a sense as an isolated thing is a bit like going to someone and saying, well, I don't like your cooking. And they say, well, I've only ever cooked hamburgers in my life. And say, why you cooked only hamburgers? Well, because that's what the boss and my restaurant wanted. So I don't have anything more than that. So we really need to go beyond that and ask, you know, what is really the cooking and why it's not fully manifested as the skill that in a way is the origin of mindfulness. So, 2 words about mindfulness and its origin, which is important here. It's based on Buddhist teaching, traditional Buddhist teaching, which says that as a human being, we have the potential for huge freedom and liberation. But the place to look for that liberation is not somewhere else, but right in the heart of our experience. And if we look directly and clearly in the heart of our experience, we find ourselves much freer than we ever imagined. And it's based on awareness, and in a way, we're not free because we forget that we're aware, we forget our power, and so we end up functioning on automatic pilot. And so mindfulness is instead of functioning on automatic pilot. And it's remembering to be aware. In other words, we do know how to be aware, but we forget. The word sati, mindfulness, in the Pali language means remembering. It's remembering to wake up to our experience, to shine the light on what is our experience in the body, in the mind, in feelings, and in also our inner world and our outer world. The first words of the Buddha in the classic text on mindfulness, Satipatthana Sutta, is mindfulness is inside and outside. It's not just a technique to withdraw from the world and go back into ourselves. And so we have to ask, what is it that helps us to feel better in mindfulness? Why is it this feel-good factor of mindfulness? So it's not a technique to kind of recruit happiness, to invent happiness. The quality of feeling better in mindfulness is that because we live close to ourselves, we begin to meet how we really live and our actual life. And that makes us feel better instead of disconnecting from our life or drowning in anxieties, worries, concerns that come into us. Instead of that, we meet our real life. We connect. Mindfulness, the basis of mindfulness is connection. So I just want to read part of a poem from my book, What is Beyond Mindfulness, that just expresses this. Have you forgotten the edges of leaves, the soft fur of cats, myths in the shapes of clouds, the stillness of the moon, the song of the wind, your own soft breath dissolving the boundary between you and the world? Have you forgotten that your troubled mind still loves stars and can see the pain behind another's eyes? Can you allow yourself to love yourself just the way you are and do the same with every stranger on the road? So I'm reading this poem because it shows some of the qualities of mindfulness that we shouldn't forget. Qualities that, firstly, are inner and outer, connecting us to the world, the stars, a stranger in the street, the pain of others. Secondly, mindfulness has in it kindness and compassion. It's already there. Thirdly, mindfulness has in it the sense of allowing both pleasant and unpleasant experiences and not trying to control the world in order for us to get happy experiences all the time. And another point is mindfulness is, it's important, a power that welcomes what arises, to give us the readiness to be with what is, rather than turning ourselves away, running away, hiding from, or shutting down. It's allowing, it's being open. That's in the poem, that's in the essence of mindfulness as well. Now, in the tradition, mindfulness is always part of a much bigger practice context. So it's one of the eightfold path, which when the Buddhist tradition says, how do you actually free yourself? There is a path, and it has 8 parts to it. Mindfulness is just one of the 8 paths, which include, for example, right speech, learning to what is speech, what is a thought, what is intention, what is our view, how to act in the world, and so on. Mindfulness is, for example, one of the 5 powers, and I have a new book out on the 5 powers, mindfulness is just one, and it's combined with trust and energy and calm and concentration and wisdom. So in that context, what happened, mindfulness arrived in the West and became really the only, it extracted itself, or the West invited mindfulness in and left behind many of the other qualities, powers, potentials, and practices which should be linked with mindfulness. So mindfulness was in a way extracted from its context in order to import it from the East into the West. And there's many reasons why the West needed some practice to, in a way, change from the old religions of the Western religions that lost their power. The West is an individualistic culture, so mindfulness is a practice that the individual can do at home or in a group and transform individually. The West isn't so interested in the community context of mindfulness, and the West is functional, material, and busy with self-development, and mindfulness just fits that beautifully, but it's self-development of the mind. So the West invited mindfulness in and left the rest behind. But it is the way that a teaching from elsewhere always goes into a culture. When Buddhism arrived in Tibet, it arrived in a very minimal way from some wild Indian sadhus that brought Buddhist teachings into the West in a rather minimal way. When Buddhism arrived in China and Japan, it arrived in a minimal way, because that's the way teachings arrive in new places. They can't arrive as a whole total package new. They come in like through the door, they open the door, and they insert themselves a bit like yoga came into the West and became very minimal as physical exercises, hatha yoga, instead of the whole Indian spiritual teaching that is yoga. So because of that, myself and many other teachers who are deeply, deeply into the essence of mindfulness and its Buddhist context have actually felt very good about the way mindfulness has arrived in the West. I didn't used to be like that. I was rather worried and cynical and concerned about the dilution and about the abuse and so on. But I think it's time to be positive and trusting and say the way mindfulness came into the West is helpful. It's time to be here. It's right. It's helping many, many, many people, including in the classrooms and including in households all over the Western world, helping many, many people to feel empowered that they can transform. They have something to do, that they can make a change. So for many people, mindfulness is a gate. But for millions, it's a gate so that some can go through the gate into the garden. And of those millions, some will go through the gate and begin to explore more deeply beyond the minimal mindfulness. And because of that, I think it's basically a positive thing, even in small doses. So what people can cope with, the small dose, fair enough, start with that. So what are we going to do to transform the situation and help mindfulness to overcome the kind of limitations, abuses, and problems that I mentioned at the beginning. The first thing is to really get familiar with what mindfulness really is, instead of limiting it to a very minimal package of self-development. And one of the places that is right there in the heart of the mindfulness itself is that ethics. The whole thing doesn't work without ethics. If you're a soldier and you're practicing mindfulness, but you're doing it in order to kill people more effectively, something there isn't going to work. It's just undoing itself. And what will happen, I don't know. But something there, in the old tradition, it's like as if you're trying to row a boat and the boat's always tied to the bank. You don't get anywhere because you're really causing suffering and harm to yourself and the world, and mindfulness is just being used or abused in this way. So ethics is a ground. As soon as you really open what is mindfulness, you will find it there as a basis. And secondly, mindfulness, if you look at it, it's an excellent basis for going out in the world. And so many, many, many people who have been practicing mindfulness and exploring mindfulness become peacemakers, become healers, go into ecological work. For example, the mindfulness teachers are at the forefront of the Extinction Rebellion movement. So mindfulness gives you a sense of freedom to be able to go out in the world and make change. And you'll see it if you look closely at what mindfulness is, a sense of empowerment. I am aware of, I'm not functioning on automatic, I'm aware of others, I'm aware of myself. Like in my poem, I see the pain behind another's eyes, I will go out and help them. So mindfulness has in it that sense of energizing us or purifying the blocks and the issues that make us helpless and allow us to go out. It has in it already compassion, but people forget this. I once visited Mark Williams, gave a talk at the Oxford Mindfulness Centre, and Professor Mark Williams has developed a very beautiful package and a teaching package, MBCT, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, especially for people with depression. And I asked him, what's the role of compassion in MBCT? And he said the whole thing doesn't work without it. It's utterly, utterly needed. And so as soon as you really kind of scrape the surface of mindfulness, you will see that it has compassion and kindness built in. In other words, if you're looking at your inner life, if you continue to be critical, attacking yourself, struggling, and so on, your mindfulness isn't really going to work. Mindfulness depends on you embracing your life and embracing your experience and being kind to yourself and then kind to others. So mindfulness connects us with the world. As I mentioned, it is about being aware of inner and outer worlds, not withdrawing, not shutting down. There is nothing in mindfulness that tells us to shut down. It can be, for a while, helpful, yes, to shut down a little bit. In other words, it can be helpful to sit quietly for half an hour in your room, take up the telephone, of course. But this is making an adjustment to give us the space to, yes, withdraw a little bit so that we can go back to our life, rather than being swept by the craziness and the busyness and the speediness and being swept away all the time. So there's an adjustment that's needed, and that adjustment, meaning coming back to yourself and turning towards your experience, can need a little bit of withdrawal, but that's just an adjustment, And very soon, hopefully soon, practicing mindfulness, you begin to realize that mindfulness is in and out. It's my life and other people's life. It's how I am and the pain of the world. It's where I feel difficulty and how injustice and conflict is out there in the world and is painful. And mindfulness gives you the power to see that. So it's very important that we can't control, and we can let go of the control of what mindfulness ought to be, because we're just not in control. The fate is in control, karma is in control. But what we can do, what we should do, is to make sure that the teachers and the leaders are deeply educated in what is mindfulness. And hopefully the teachers need teachers in schools that teach it, teachers in groups that teach it. There we need to work and kind of really encourage the sense that they're not doing justice to the inner freedom that's possible if you do a quickie. A quick training, a couple of weeks, mindfulness, and go out and teach. You're not doing justice. There's a pain in that as well. That message has to be passed over. And I'm doing that constantly. I'm teaching the teachers of mindfulness in Israel, and I teach MBSR teachers constantly, and I teach them to realize that there is a much bigger world in this world of mindfulness. And that's my role, and that's what I enjoy. One of the things I enjoy is teaching teachers and giving them a sense of the bigness, the vastness of what it is that they've got beyond technique and beyond a minimal package. So at the same time, teachers should manifest and be examples of what mindfulness can help you to become. To go beyond issues of race, issues of labeling, issues of religion, issues of personal history, issues of conflict. For example, in America, there's many black teachers who are teaching in the black community because the Anglo-Saxon community realized that they don't have a good language to get out to the black community. The black community needs to own its mindfulness. And so that's happening in Oakland and other places in America, which I think is very positive. I've tried to teach Palestinians here in Israel, and it's possible, but there needs to be Palestinian teachers to teach mindfulness in that culture. So that's one of the ways forward. Another point is the radical nature of mindfulness. It should be understood as being pretty radical because it's opening the truth of things. So if you're in a classroom as a student and you see that the whole system is contaminated, is controlling, is restricting, is a kind of a prison, that the society is operating like that, the Buddha said, confront the truth. Confront the truth of things. Actually, the Buddha said, be an island to yourself. In other words, stand your ground and stand on your truth, and from that place, go out in the world. Don't be swept away by the consensus, by the norms, by what everybody agrees, by the mind of the herd. Don't be swept away. The Buddha said it very clearly. How do you not be swept away? Because you stand on your truth. I meet my breath, I meet my body, I meet my mind, I take responsibility for what's going on in this person, and because of that, I can stand my place and I can make change in the world. So mindfulness is very radical in that sense, and that should be understood and allowed, even if it's sometimes opening a Pandora's box. It's better that this society is in critical place, the whole civilization is in a way collapsing, the society is in critical change and struggle, and we need people who are basically able to go out and make change. And mindfulness can empower that. So one of the places also to understand is actually to invite a little bit the context from which mindfulness came from. It's like, as I say, if you want to cook properly, go and see how the Indians do it, and then you'll be able to cook curries, not just hamburger. So the traditional aspects, for example, the 5 powers, which I wrote about, which is my new book. One of the powers is the power of trust. Now, the power of trust goes along with mindfulness. It's not already, it's partly in there, but it's extending mindfulness to a place of trust. We really need it in today's world, when there's a tendency with the virus and with the ecology and with the climate change and with the insecurity of politics for everybody to get lost in anxiety, in panic, in insecurity, and in helplessness. And how to develop trust is a really important quality which we can learn from the tradition going along with mindfulness. One of the powers, the 5 powers, is trust. We can learn it. So touching mindfulness, that's really arrived in the Western world. Now let's invite trust. Let's invite wisdom. Let's invite calm, samadhi, concentration. So the wisdom mind is the mind allowing change that is deep, that is in the personality, that is not just technique, but to sense that mindfulness with wisdom can really change the way we get up in the morning, we look at the world, we act in the world from a bigger place. And the final thought, in the tradition, the model is the model of feeding. It has there's a nutritional model in the Buddhist teaching, which many people don't know so well, but it's right there in the heart of the teaching. Meaning, instead of fighting, struggling against inner problems that you have or outer problems that you see, the nutritional model will say, feed the freedom and don't feed our problems or issues. So you have a problem like judgmental mind, sense of being victim, sense of being critical or judgmental. Instead of fighting this inner pattern, you feed your freedom and you just don't feed the problem. Attachment, non-attachment, is the language in the Western world, but in the Buddhist world, upadana is feeding. It's the word that attachment has been translated from upadana. So there's something in this whole tradition which is very healing, and it's feeding the solutions and not feeding the problems, rather than being part of conflict, attacking in the name of mindfulness or in the name of change, attacking them, anger, rage, conflict in the name of a better society or a better human being. So I think it's quite an important way to look at mindfulness, the nutritional model. And final word, mindfulness takes us beyond. We shouldn't forget that it's fundamentally a spiritual journey. So this doesn't need to put it way beyond most human beings, because I believe most human beings have in their core, in their center, an appreciation of their spirit, the pure spirit inside. In whatever dose we have it, but it is there, and we need to acknowledge it, and mindfulness can help with that. Thank you.
מיקרופון, מיקי. מיקי, לא שומעים אותך.
Okay, sorry, I understood that. Yeah,
Okay.
there was a problem. I will begin from the beginning. So thank you very much, Stephen, for this very important talk. And we will have now 2 minutes to reflect and write comments and questions to the chat box. I will stop after 2 minutes and we'll continue then. You're invited to write and comments and questions. Okay, we will go on now to the next lecture, but before that, I will ask Janina to unmute and to... Amir, can you help Janina to unmute? Amir, Irit? Yeah, okay.
So it's absolutely a pleasure to introduce Kelli now. I'll just say a word or two. We met last fall. I happened to see the film that Kelli produced, Elisa and the Mind Jar, and I gave it to my students to watch, and I made contact with Kelli, and it so turned out that she happened to be in Israel at the time, and I invited her to come to Oranim, and she had a fabulous meeting with my third-year students in our Department of English Language and Literature. She was able to transcend the local issues and see beyond that. And she reached out to my students, and we had a wonderful, wonderful session of talking about difficulties that students were experiencing in their educational settings. And she spoke about different approaches that she would take to that. After that, I visited New York in early February of this year, before things changed. And Kelli invited me to her school in the Bronx. And I spent a wonderful morning. It was a Thursday, rainy morning in February, where I went to her school and saw how she worked with lovely little children in elementary school, teaching them a lot of the principles of what we talk about here. It was just absolutely phenomenal to see. But the thing that I wanted to mention now is that when I went out with Kelli at lunchtime, we were walking on the sidewalk to a little store down the road where we were going to get something to eat for lunch. And what struck me was that when people passed Kelli, just people in the neighborhood, they knew her. She was part of the community. And one could see there and in the store how much respect they had for Kelli as a member of the community. And this was very powerful for me, because if I have to educate my students or in our department, that is the role that I would love to see an educator taking, being a central part of the community. And that's what Kelli embodies for me.
Thank you, Janina. I forgot to say that Janina is the head of English department in Oranim College, and she has the project to transform all the department in a mindful department. Hopefully we will manage. Okay, Nir, we can now continue with Kelli Love lecture, which was also pre-recorded, as I mentioned before. Thank you, Janina.
Welcome. I'm Kelli. I am a mindfulness educator. I've been in the field of education for nearly 20 years and have been practicing mindfulness for myself in nearly the same amount of time. Currently, I work at a school in the South Bronx in New York City as the mindfulness teacher, and I also work with teachers to support them in bringing mindfulness to themselves and exploring mindfulness in their classrooms and their school communities. What I want to say today is that let's explore some questions. Let's explore some key questions about mindfulness and mindfulness in education. And really, for the past 5 to 10 years, mindfulness has kind of exploded. And we can see many books on mindfulness in education. We see apps, articles. And so now we might take a look back and see what key questions are important to ask and see if we can examine some pitfalls and perhaps what our blind spots might be. And also really look at how radical mindfulness in education might be. What is its true potential? And in many ways, mindfulness is still in its infancy. So I'll really want to share my thoughts from what my experience has been. And I'd like to begin by saying that the questions that we ask ourselves of each other in this field are what's crucial. And it's important to ask, what questions are we asking ourselves as educators? As someone who longs to bring mindfulness to ourselves or to others, as a friend, as a parent, what questions are we sitting with? What I've found is that the critical question that we begin with is, what is our purpose as we bring mindfulness into education? And that we need to return to this question over and over. And the reason this question is critical is because when bringing mindfulness into educational environments, we need to get honest and return because our intentions may be mixed unknowingly. And that we can frame our mindfulness around 3 touch points. So we can think about mindfulness for ourselves. So what might be our intention for mindfulness for ourselves as an educator? The second touch point would be, we can really frame a critical aspect of mindfulness as noticing how our personal practice impacts our relationships. How does our practice impact our relationship with our students? How does it make, even we could just say like the vibe in the room, our presence with our students? How do we react when something we didn't plan for arises in the moment? And the third touch point would be exploring practices with students, with children, facilitating the practice of mindfulness. So this last touch point is not necessarily what I'll be exploring as much in our talk today, except for I really want to emphasize a key underpinning of trauma-informed mindfulness, which is choice, and embedding baked-in choice throughout facilitation of mindfulness, especially for children, as a key thing that might go away when a child impacts or experiences trauma. When a child is impacted by trauma, is their sense of choice, their sense of agency. So we could say that, to begin, that maybe the most largest potential is giving that choice back, a sense of power, the power to choose. So to back up a little bit, if we aren't exploring mindfulness for ourselves personally as educators and in relationship with our students, then we aren't exploring mindfulness in education at all. Our own understanding of the practice is where it begins, and it must be the priority. Our relationships must be the priority over imparting or exploring practices with children. So meaning, if we don't prioritize the relational piece of mindfulness, we will bump up again against children thinking that mindfulness is not for them. So then the invitation will be at that point, because it's likely that that will happen given the developmental aspects of children, that the inquiry will then be, how do I meet resistance? How do I meet resistance with myself? How do I meet resistance with my students? And what does that feel like? And how do I explore mindfulness through challenge and beginning to ask oneself again, returning to what are my intentions here and how can I explore this practice creatively? And for myself first. So as we explore our purpose, we can ask, is it to bring transformation, freedom? Is it to bring authenticity, deep listening into school cultures? Or is bringing mindfulness into education just another disguise for fostering the same systems of power that often come into play in institutional environments and the student to teacher relationship? Is it just another tool to calm down? If we're drawn to bringing mindfulness into educational environments, this is the question we are responsible to return to. Are we stewarding children towards who they naturally are, validating their authentic selves, or are we simply maintaining order through mindfulness? So if you are at all curious about mindfulness for yourself as an educator, I urge you to observe your intentions non-judgmentally and see how they play out in the moments again and again, and unpack your intentions, your purpose, and notice when our own conditioning arises. And maybe it might be individual conditioning or the collective conditioning. And what's important is that we have the courage to look and to know ourselves as educators so that we offer from a place of humble service. The next critical question that we ask is, what is the inner work of an educator? So even asking this question is radical and transformative. I know I didn't have the space so much to answer that in my teacher education program. So what is the specific inner work of someone who's practicing mindfulness, or of an educator in particular? So I always begin with Parker Palmer's statement in his book, The Courage to Teach. And he says, you teach who you are. So then we're confronted with the wide impact that how we show up in the room deeply impacts who's in it. Especially if everyone else is anchoring to us. So what's essential is that teachers are given the permission to examine our beliefs, our emotional terrain, and to know the breadth of our own humanity so that we can relate to our students from a place of compassion. Similarly, we are who we spend time with. In the context of educational environments, what is the felt sense and power of a mindful community? Children don't have the choice to opt in into many of their relationships. With compassion, we can ask, how are we showing up as teachers? How are we living in our bodies, our minds, and our hearts when we're in the company of children? And we can acknowledge that our adult development matters. Our inner work is knowing moments of pause, waiting and looking at our impulses. Our inner work is a responsibility toward examining our own trauma so that it doesn't leak out into our relationships with our students. And when it does, we do the work of courageous repair. Our inner work is to investigate how to compassionately hold ourselves through the challenges of being an educator, because it is challenging work. How do I meet myself as a teacher in all that arises while caring for, guiding, and holding space for learning in a classroom? Our inner work is being curious about what we might need to unlearn. For me, it's been a courageous look into my relationship with control, even in the smallest of moments with my students. How can I plan for this moment, in this moment that I didn't plan for? So, to summarize, the first touch point is knowing that teaching is a path of inner work for yourself and between yourself with your students, between you and your students, and noticing the impact of your practice. If mindfulness is allowing the fullness of ourself to come forward, to be honest, and we seek to give that same permission to our children, we must be in the experiment. So the second potential that I want to explore is this potential that we call post-traumatic recovery. So many children in the world today have experienced moments, so perhaps single incident or complex long-term trauma. So as we know, there is a feeling after trauma of losing your agency, your sense of control over a moment. So having an environment that is supportive of noticing our inner world, allowing small moments that illuminate how we're feeling, where emotions are living in our body, and a space for exploring a variety of practices that allow us to care for our difficult emotions would be significant for many children that experience trauma. So herein lies the potential for fostering more empathy in the world. As children are allowed to feel challenging emotions, perhaps even see the wisdom in them, and as teachers are encouraged to know their full humanity, and professionally through the invitation of mindfulness. So this would be mindfulness in education, that it would be where a world allows a girl who maybe practices mindfulness in the group context, gets in touch with a part of her that's angry, and can share in the group context what she noticed was that anger and how her body felt, or maybe her heart is sad and maybe her heart feels bruised, a yellow bruising. She can get specific and know her heart or know her difficult emotions and share them in the group context, have them be held in a safe and trusting way, to be a girl in this world and stand up and say, I noticed I felt anger, and have that validated and have someone say, and that's okay. That is radical and transformative. So one potential then, as we move further into this exploration of trauma, of knowing our body, knowing our emotions, is giving children the opportunity to explore really deeply, but in the smallest of moments, their inner knowing. So it could be explored in something as simple as we begin our practice today, see if it feels right to close your eyes or open them. See if it feels right to sit up or lie down. Would you like to move your body in smaller circles or larger circles? Would you like to move a little faster or slower? And if your arms want to move in smaller circles, how does your body know? So the permission to listen and not be in lockstep with everyone else is a profound permission to know oneself in these small moments of the practice. In my classroom, I have a poster that says, if it doesn't feel right, then we stop and we check it out and we make a choice. So we might stop and check it out, and it might be something like take a break, or pause and take a breath. It might be continue onward. But it is the built-in permission to ask oneself, is this moment, is this teaching, is this instruction right for me? Is it not right for me? Or am I just not sure? Do I need to check in? And that has landed incredibly profound as a teacher, as I assess how the facilitation is going based on, are my students following their inner knowing, or are they just following me? So a key question I ask them is, let's check it out together. I'm not sure if this looks right or feels right for you. How does it feel for you in your body? What is your body telling you? So we can expand this further into the metaphor of the brake, right? When someone learns to drive, the first place that we show them is the brake. So as educators, we can ask ourselves, we can assess, have we shown our students how to put on the brakes? Because a pitfall could be, while children are exploring, they might bump up against, oh, this is too much for me. This isn't for me right now. So have we baked into the structured environment that they can ask themselves, they can say no or take a break, and then continue on with the practice? So this is the embedded structured choice of mindfulness in trauma-informed practice. And I also really feel an obligation here to say that it's important for educators to really stay in their lane and build a collaborative practice when bringing mindfulness to children and communicate with other persons in the building, like social workers, when moments arise. So know and communicate to your children that there might be moments where more questions arise when a practice is explored, and be willing to have one-on-one conversations and listen to what happened and explore that with children. Because in a group context, especially in a practice that's deeply inward, there will be questions and explorations, and we're in this experiment together. So the inquiry of choice becomes the learning. But then the pitfall with trauma is that the investigation of sensations might not always be of ease. So when we explore and we come upon something that's not easy, we have to strike this balance. Maybe that's not for me now, and maybe I can build capacity for learning to explore what's uncomfortable. As a 5-year-old, can I explore my anger that wants to explode all over me? Can I have the experience of knowing that maybe all of myself feels angry right now, but there's a part of me that doesn't? Or that my sadness feels so heavy. But sharing it in the group context makes me feel known and seen. So there is an allowing of being with our experience when inviting children to see their emotional terrain as visitors, and to allow it all. That is part of the key thread, right? In education, when I first became an educator, we used to call feelings positive and negative. And now it's comfortable and uncomfortable, or pleasant and unpleasant. And we can invite them all as visitors in our house and get curious. I would say that would be another keynote, is the opportunity to be curious. So these choice points are really a safeguard for knowing when we might say that we're able to explore the uncomfortable and explore when the brakes need to be put on, and kind of go back and forth and give children in a language they can understand, and assess that they are really taking that in. Because there's so much in educational environments that asks them not to know their inner knowing, not to make choices for themselves. When we think about trauma, it's not just thinking about how might trauma show up for our kids. It's how does our own trauma show up in the classroom? So back to that first touch point. If you're someone who has trauma in your history, as many of us do, we can ask the question as an educator, how can I turn towards my trauma? How can I turn and look at what I've not been facing? And we can even think about, if we're not sure, were there moments in our life where we felt completely overwhelmed? That we weren't sure if we felt our own sense of power. So for me, I knew that that trauma that I experienced in my childhood was leaking out into my classroom when I'd feel tension in my whole body when students resisted what I wanted them to do. I started to take in the reflections of others, including, or most importantly, my students. I started to see them as teachers, to take their resistance as information and insight, and often wisdom, and to let go of this image of me standing in front of the room giving directions. I started to invite them into an experience and give them multiple entry points and exit points for their participation. Those moments were part of my mindful teaching practice. And the gift of those moments was where my students started exploring their inner knowing. Was when I was able to step back and give them more space, give them more power. So I'd lastly like to give a voice to the body. In mindfulness practice, the body is the beginning and the end. To know the signals of our body when in quiet is one thing, and another in the company of a group of children. So to know the message that your body is telling you when you're overwhelmed, and to also know your body as a resource. So I use my hands on my heart when I teach, or my hands on my belly to settle it. I have a colleague who places her hands on her legs and rubs her legs to soothe her body when she's teaching, if she notices that there's tension building up from what's happening in the room. So it's an important inquiry to ask, what is it that brings you into presence? What is it that brings you into your own body? And explore that. What allows you to settle? If we'll be the anchor for others, it's important that we get intimate with what allows us to settle. Whenever we're in a room with children, we can look around. We can orient ourselves to the environment, listen to the sounds, see the movement, and then return back to our body. We can pause. And being in our body gives us the container to examine the moment. So for me, I've come back to really examining my own trauma again and again through these moments of pause. I had to really notice what was it and how did my history show up in the room, and use my body as an inner resource if something felt overwhelming, to connect and have contact with my body as a refuge and reclaim that. So one other last thought is to check our own beliefs. I use my own experience as a white teacher in the South Bronx, so mostly Black and brown students in the US. And over the years, I've really thought about what that means and what input I've taken in. So there's this notion, this idea of saviorism. And it's been important for me to really look and see maybe what information contributed to my own conditioning through the media. So growing up on Hollywood movies, for example, and it's important to think about how those movies impact our intentions as an educator. Again, back to why are we interested in bringing this work into educational environments? So am I seeing the gifts of each child? Their worthiness is internal. And the strengths of each family. There's nothing I'm giving my students that they don't already have. And nothing I'm there to fix. And we have to remember that great intentions aren't enough. Because even if we have great intentions, doing harm through our unconscious beliefs is still possible. And this is why sensitivity in our body is the beginning and ending of practice, especially in the room with children. Our body is giving us information. When something doesn't feel right about even our own thought process, it can be a live moment where we say to ourselves, I'm thinking something about this student or person that is contradicting the nice things that I'm saying. And there's a sensory impact in our body when maybe we're out of alignment. So this is a long-term exploration with watching and sensing. But there is deep power in exploring the watching of our mind. And as we unlearn, there may be moments like this that we encounter, but our practice becomes the refuge. And then we make a pact with ourselves that becomes our honesty. And what's radical is the willingness to watch and explore absolutely everything. Especially as an educator, there will be a constant interruption in this process, but coming back and returning, to be there, to watch, without judgment, and notice how you're changed. For me, I'm completely different than I was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago as an educator. And to know that it's a marathon, not a sprint. So there's no quick fixes with mindfulness in education. Teaching is incredibly joyful and yet also incredibly uncomfortable. So it's important to keep coming back to awareness and watching the resistance that might arise. And to close, I would like to just re-emphasize these 3 threads for us today. The practice begins with ourself, learning ourself, integrating choice in as many moments as we can. Even asking, how do you know? How does your body tell you? Wanting to say in closure is that while there are a lot of strategies, there's a lot of skills out there, and teaching at the level of strategy and skills is important. Offering activities to build things like empathy and kindness is critical, whether we're teaching a 3-year-old or a 25-year-old. What we need to ask, though, at the core is what we are offering, does it have choice embedded in it? Are we providing a space for a child to know themselves, to become themselves? To ask, is this right for me, or is it not? To be in the not knowing. when our teaching provides the structure for this question, we're not imposing our power, but providing a healing space for the power to choose. Our purpose is service, to be in service of serving the inner knowing. In that is radical in offering a sense of freedom and curiosity. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Kelly, for this really deep talk. I just want to mention a bug. For those who are looking at the chat, you will remark that all of the chat are with the name Miki Motola. So for someone who is working on his ego, it is really a challenging, moment. And I'm sorry, I don't know, there is no way to reconstruct the name of the people who wrote. So this is the way, this is the unforeseen things. Thank you, Kelly, again. So now we'll go to Amir.
Hi, I've been collecting the dozens of questions and comments that were coming in throughout your talks, Stephen and Kelly, and trying to group them into kind of the main topics. And I have a few questions that your talks seem to touch on a few subjects that I feel a few questions arose that really apply to both of you. So I'd like to start with these, and then if we have time, I don't know, there are like 2 dozen questions. So whatever, if we have time, I'll go more into specific questions to Kelly and to Stephen. But let's start with the ones that are applied to both of you. So the first one would be about the fact that both of you teach mindfulness and are social activists. You, Kelly, are working in a Black and brown neighborhood, and Stephen is active engaged in peace work. Could you talk a bit about the work that you do and how these 2 aspects of your lives, mindfulness and social activism, how do they come together or relate to each other? Is one of them prior to the other or more foundational than the other? Do they sometimes conflict with each other?
Stephen, you have to unmute. Amir? Stephen? Okay, yes. Yes, it's okay.
Keeps muting itself. Okay.
I can hear you.
Kelly, can you unmute also?
Okay. It keeps muting itself, so I unmuted myself now. Now it's working. Kelly, would you want to kick off? Shall I kick off?
Please.
So, for my in my own experience, the movement has been in a few different directions. One is that in my heart, since a child, I've always had a kind of power interest to try and sort of save the world. I've been trying since a child. I've been seeing the pain of the community, and I've been, in a way, feeling it since I was a child. But what mindfulness helped me to do is to begin to undo all kinds of blocks and issues and labels that stopped me. So, for example, the narrative in the mind that says you can't do it, you're just a small cog in the wheel, a brick in the wall, as in the song of the Pink Floyd. So what difference can you make? A narrative of helplessness, a narrative of they don't really want me, a narrative of easier for me to stay at home, more comfortable to do nothing, a narrative of what about the rest, the society is not going to like me, I'm going to be excluded or kicked out. So all of that has really, the mindfulness has really purified all these narratives that disempower. And at the same time, mindfulness has allowed my heart to be really clear. And I remember so many times when I really felt in my heart the pain of others. And I just got up in the morning and said, I cannot stay at home now. I am going off to Nablus, the Palestinian territories, or other places, and collect a group, and we will do, I have to listen to my heart. So it was, in a way, not shutting down the heart, mindfulness allowing the heart to express itself and allowing compassion to flow, because it's kind of undoing the resistance to compassion and to a wide open heart. Less selfing, actually. And the third thing about mindfulness is when everyone's losing their head, somebody needs to keep theirs. In other words, I really found myself again and again in situations where mindfulness gave me a steadiness, just as the Buddha said, be an island to yourself. It allowed me to be steady in the middle of conflict and pain, and really try and kind of radiate, like Kelli was saying in the classroom, radiate a presence and a helpfulness and a positivity. And all of that came from the mindfulness practice itself. I felt it really worked in the heat of conflict and difficulty and pain, whether it's working with dying people, which I've done a lot, or working in peace work, it doesn't really matter. Wherever you go in the suffering world, the mindfulness helps you, I think, to stand firm and offer help rather than be swept away by anxieties, helplessness, and other things.
Kelli?
I think what I can say is that for me, what has seemed political and radical is taking a stance of saying and allowing and supporting the knowing of your inner world matters. And I will be here with you to explore it. So that in itself is political. And I would say that as an educator, being willing to humbly and honestly know that there's a lot going on in here, and that if I emphasize knowing what's happening inside as a priority, especially when I'm with children, and knowing that that is a key thread in providing a space for them, for listening to themselves, I think that that is inherently maybe an act of social justice to give them permission to feel in a world that isn't necessarily supportive, but also just, if I think of what it's like to learn how to be a teacher and to be maybe like institutionally, there's so much emphasis on the external world, on being out there, and our responsibility is so much emphasized on what's going on out there, that emphasizing the importance of pausing and learning and understanding is an act of a social justice, and that knowing myself, like individually, that's what I can truly, I don't like the word control, but that's what I have the power to change, I guess. So I can't really speak beyond that, but I know that if I continue to practice within myself and see how my practice shows up with my students, that that will have a deep and lasting impact. And if I foster this kind of loving presence in a community, that will have a deep impact. And in those moments of, and I love, you know, what Stephen spoke to, that just in the moment of taking a stand, that in itself, you know, that many times in the mindfulness world, we bump up against this misconception that it's a complacency, but taking a stand is a moment of mindfulness also.
Well, I'd like to add to this question. Somebody else wrote another question that is related to what both of you just spoke about, and especially in light of what you just said, Kelly, which is, if we follow our responsibilities to society by, let's say, protesting, taking a stand in a highly charged social or political situation, getting politically involved, which is unavoidable when you become a social activist, aren't we identifying with our thoughts and feelings and unwittingly feeding the very problems that we want to reduce or eliminate in the world?
I agree that there's an issue there, Amir. Sometimes we need righteous anger. It can move a mountain. We just had enough. So I absolutely don't want to put down anybody or any movement in which the heart tells us we have to go out and make change. We have to allow the heart to express itself. Mindfulness is not a kind of blanket that we put on ourselves and kind of neutralize ourselves. However, I do think that slowly, as we get engaged in the inner work, we begin to be less controlled by the changing winds of our emotions. We just can allow the emotions, including anger, including rage, including we see injustice, and it moves the heart. All of that can get lighter and lighter. That we don't shut it down, but it gets lighter, because it's rather a crude weapon. Righteous anger will move mountains, but it's a bit crude. It's slowly, we want to turn into we want to be a Nelson Mandela. You know, after 26 years in prison, he came out with such a beautiful sense of presence and not rage. And I think that's a direction for us, not to shut down the feelings, but slowly to get them to be lighter and less dominant and less making us a puppet of feelings. Anger, this, we just turn into puppets. I think that has to get slowly lighter in us through practice.
Well, Kelly, would you say that the kind of mindfulness that you teach in schools help make social activists and people who are socially and politically more aware? Is that your experience, or is that one of the purposes or goals of your work as a teacher of mindfulness?
I would say that my purpose is to include all of our experience. And so there's this term a lot that comes up, I think, in mindfulness and also in its relationship to social activism, that is spiritual bypassing. So we can think of sometimes anger is an expression of saying no. Like, what is the initial seed of a moment of anger, just as it arises, as the impulse comes in our body? Like, the smallest seed or the impulse might be a wisdom. No, this moment isn't right. So if just in the context, say, of, for me, you asked the way that I teach or with my students, a school community, like I said in my talk, if there's a moment where a student stands up and says, a part of me feels angry right now, and that the response is, that's okay, and tell me more, I'm here to listen. Yes, to answer your question, yes. There are 3 other things that came up about that I wanted to add. But mainly just to expand on that first point is that it's not to avoid these types of feelings, just mindfulness says, may we honestly look at everything that's arising with compassion. So in the context of protest, that the previous question says, you know, aren't we identifying with our feelings? And so maybe a person could be participating in a protest, but if mindfulness is paying attention to what's happening, being close to the moment with curiosity and openness, and they're participating in a protest and doing that, right? If they're knowing what's happening in their body. And as Stephen said, internally and externally, in that moment in the protest, and they're listening to themselves, each step along the way. Does this moment feel right to me? Does it not? How is this moment rising in my body? How's my mind responding? That's just mindfulness in another moment. And maybe something unexpected happens. And then I, you know, respond in a way I didn't plan for. So as Stephen said in his talk, it's connection. Am I connected to this moment as it's arising? And lastly, I want to say, in terms of this connection with mindfulness and social justice, that there are many ways to participate. So protesting is one very important way, historically and in the present moment, to participate. But participating could also look like deeply listening in conversations with the people that you know, noticing your habitual responses as they come up. For me, with my students, noticing when my privilege shows up, pausing before I speak, being a listener more than anything, being humble. So I think that it's could also just be really willing to be an examiner of our unconscious beliefs. I think those are the three things that I wanted to say.
Thank you. I think there are two more questions that are related to it, which came in. One, I'll just read as it was written. It says, I'm an Afro-Native American teacher who has generational trauma due to historical genocide and injustices. I currently teach students of color who have had the same experiences. The current state of America has brought some of these feelings of sadness and anxiety to the surface, and I know it is a feeling that my students may also have. I want to improve my mindfulness to help myself and my students. Where do I begin? Thank you. So that's one question. And the other is, Kelli spoke of the value of mindfulness for healing or overcoming trauma. Do you see it also potentially helpful in becoming aware of and overcoming collective and historical traumas, such as that of refugees, the Black community in the United States, the Jewish and Palestinian communities in Israel, etc., which are not only traumas on an individual basis, but on a collective basis? How does mindfulness help deal with traumas that are collective rather than personal?
Kelli, you want to start for a change?
Yeah. I'm going to take a moment to think what I want to say.
The way I do want to invite Miki, Amir, if you want to offer, you know, both of you have a lot of experience, and if you feel like you're offering a contribution, I think it's really fine that we open it a little bit to you as well.
Thank you.
So if it comes up.
I think that what has been landing with me deeply so far in this discussion that I've been having with my circles and the people that I'm in relationship with is that the truth will set you free. So this part of being able to be honest have agency. So in my talk, I said that the beginning and end is in the body. So I don't know if I can really speak extensively to your question, but I can speak individually that for me, having a practice has been a source of feeling alive. And so you ask about this sort of post-traumatic recovery, and I think the one thing that I can speak on is the sense of being in touch with your aliveness. And sometimes that's being able to say what your truth is. But I think you're right. We do really need to think beyond just this single incident trauma or even complex trauma. I know that there's a really great book that I'm interested in reading that I haven't read yet by Resmaa Menakem called My Grandmother's Hands. And I know that he's a trauma psychologist, and he refers to, instead of PTSD, the P in post-traumatic
stress.
Yeah, stress, to persistent. So there are some of us that are constantly, persistently encountering I know that the power of community, that's one exploration of our talk, having community, to have a support and to be able to just have a support to reflect what your truth is. I think that's what I want to add.
I would like to add, Amir, if it's possible.
Yeah, sure.
In our pre-discussion, when we discussed last week a little bit to prepare this meeting, I was raising the question and issue of the internal and external world when you are in a conflictual situation. And I think that one of the worst things that you can do, I'm talking now also as a psychologist, is to tell a person that what he's experiencing in the outer world, it's only a matter of his internal world. Okay, so there is a famous saying of Fanon, it's a psychiatrist from the Algerian psychiatrist, who said that if some patient come to you and is in the dominated population and is telling you that he had a dream that some policeman or is running off and beating him, okay, you have to check if it is not true in the reality, not just to tell him that it is, now we will deal it in your inner world. So as before Kelli said that it is very important to acknowledge and legitimize feelings of anger in an individual sphere. I think it is really very important, and you take a chance here because it is really a step to acknowledge also the outer reality as in a collective way. So I'm thinking of the fact that when Stephen is going to Nablus, just by doing it, is acknowledging that something is wrong in the external world, and it's very important for the people there, okay? So there is really here something that we have to see very careful, which is really, as I told you, the same process in the same issue in the psychology and in mindfulness. Really, we have some time to dare to say, yeah, the reality outside is wrong, okay? And it is complex, but we don't have to be afraid of complexity.
I think it challenges us to be very broad with how we define mindfulness. And I think this is right in the middle of Kelly's contribution here, and mine also. We have to see mindfulness as not a thing that is one track, but it's like learning to play music. When we can, if you really learn to play music, you can play many, many instruments. So we cannot use the same instrument with someone who is has experienced in their life much trauma with someone else who has not, and we shouldn't have, you know, values such as silence, quiet, and say that's above all. We need to allow the pain, and the pain can shut us down or open us up. And that's a very basic message in mindfulness. We allow the pain, and the pain is our teacher in a way. So, for example, if we have a label that is dominating our inner life, and the label is I'm Afro-American, I'm Palestinian, I'm Israeli, whatever, all the labels that can cause pain, we can look at them and begin to dilute them, and then we find we're lighter and we're less burdened. And the same with our emotions. Someone can be in conflict with us and shout at us and so on, but as much as Kelly was saying, we can allow the anger to be seen in the body, to be seen in the other person, to the compassionate heart to be opened. We feel ourselves and the other person together in a kind of a painful situation. We end up wiser. And the wisdom is, instead of automatic reactivity from I am hurt, I'm a victim, we want to kind of come out of the automatic reactivity, and then the wisdom will help us to know how to really make change in the community.
This connects to another question that has to do with, I think you both spoke about basic mindfulness, or as Stephen put it, the minimal package, and then elements that have to be added to it. And I think we have just been speaking about, you know, elements that help practitioners become more socially aware, caring, and responsible. And the question is, should such elements be added to basic mindfulness right from the start, or should a certain foundation of, say, what we can call the minimal package, should that foundation be built first before those elements that have to do with social awareness and responsibility can be added to that?
That's a good question. And in my experience, it needs to be there from the beginning. For example, if kindness was a little bit more expressed from the beginning, even if it's a challenge and people don't quite understand what it means to be kind to my mind, if you like, problematic kind of issue, but it needs to be there at the beginning as messages to show that we're talking about something which is empowering. Because my problem is reducing from the beginning, contracting mindfulness into a functional mode called a thing to be done. And there, I think right from the beginning, we need to see mindfulness has multi-leveled, and that people will explore it. They will feel also, as Kelly was saying, they will feel validated if it's a bigger picture, that their emotions are not a problem because I'm not with my breath, and their thoughts and narratives in the mind are problematic because I should be with my breath, and this should be is a sign of something contracted. So my sense is right from the beginning we need to mindfulness is awareness, kindness, respect, allowing, trusting ourselves and our experience, as Kelly was saying, and opening a door that we really already have and we forgot, the sense of being deeply at home in ourself. And that needs to be there, I think, right at the beginning.
Oh, yes. I've been noticing, for me, that's what's coming up. If there was like one word to describe mindfulness, it would be listening. A few questions ago, Amir, someone had said, I don't know where to begin, or where do I begin? Because in the world, the moment right now, for many of us, and for more of us than others, can feel overwhelming. And that happens. The instruction is, right? Say close to the moment. The moment is I don't know. May I listen? And one thing that I think that we've been pointing to, that I still experience in my own personal practice, is this need to unravel the conditioning of even like modern mindfulness. So the instructions that we've heard in the media, you know, on commercials or from our mindfulness teachers themselves, that, like Stephen was just mentioning, you know, many times there's like one anchor, for example, offered, the breath. And if I've experienced trauma, many times maybe the breath isn't a primary anchor that's accessible to me in this moment. So that, like I mentioned in my talk, there are many entry points. So that in any moment, I can know for myself as a practitioner that all instructions are provisional to what's happening for me in this moment. And I can ask myself, where does presence, where does it want to feel right now in my body? Is it my heart? Is it my feet? But where is it showing up to me? So I can ask and be a listener. So I would say to that person that's asking, where do I begin? It's just that, may I listen?
Amir, I would like to add,
Yes, please.
As Stephen said in the beginning, for me, mindfulness, it's not a thing. It's not, now I can add, it's not a protocol. That we are using this word often. It's not a protocol, because you are there from the first moment, as Kelli so nicely put it all the time. We are there with our presence. And from the first minute, there are many things that's happening there. And we are conveying many things that we know and that we don't know. So from the first moment, everything is there. That's what I believe. So you cannot deconstruct this. So for me, this is the answer.
Wow, we have only 6 minutes left for this conversation, and there's a lot more, maybe 24 more questions that came in. So maybe I'll use the last few minutes to ask you, in light of everything we spoke so far, and the complexity and the multidimensionality of, shall we say, the different skills that are required of a teacher of mindfulness in order to be able to address all these different aspects. So a question came in: when would you say is it safe for a novice teacher or practitioner of mindfulness to start teaching mindfulness to students? I know it's a very big general question, so maybe if each of you could tell, when did you feel it was time for you to start teaching mindfulness to others? What kind of indicated for you that you were ready for that?
I think it's partly that when you don't care whether you're a mindfulness teacher or not, then you should start teaching. I've been practicing 20 years before some people came to me and said, well, we hear you're practicing kind of Buddhist practitioner, come and give us some of your knowledge, your wisdom, your practice. And I'd never thought about it before. I think we have to kind of undo the sense also the thingness of mindfulness, and do also the thingness of being a mindfulness teacher, that it's a status and it's a role and it's needed and it might earn you some money. I think in a way to get out of that, one of the keys is if people want you, if people feel that you really have something to contribute, let them ask you. And that's a good sign. Another good sign is if you don't get stuck too much with the, you know, again, Kelly, quoting you a lot also, you'll be quoting each other, which is lovely. But you said when someone challenges you in a group, in a classroom, which is one of the most challenging, I have it easy because I'm not in classrooms, I'm with adults. But classroom is much more problematic and difficult. But if someone challenges you and says no, and says stop, and says I don't want, so, you know, where are you in your inner life with that? And how are you able to dissolve that, to look at it honestly, but not to let it come up as a sort of a screen and a defense and anger from you to others and so on and so on. So that's what you, in the Buddhist teaching of the three poisons, are really, really important. I don't say that people should be clean like a Buddha, kind of squeaky clean and white like a white sheet, but quite a lot of inner purity is needed, I think. And then you feel can stand in the middle of the heat. I can stand in the middle of the heat of a class that doesn't agree with me or anything like that. And I have a kind of enough space inside to be able to handle that. And then I think to some extent you're ready.
Thank you. Kelly, would you like to add?
Yeah, I mean, I would like in that moment, can you tell me more about that? I don't delude myself with this. I don't want to assume. I know that, you know, there are books on Amazon you can buy about mindfulness and education. So it's important for me. I love this metaphor of learning to swim, like say in a pool, for example. If you were a parent and you wanted your child to learn how to swim, you would want the instructor, you wouldn't want them to be teaching from outside of the pool. And even more, you would want them to know how to swim in the deeper end of the pool. So I think just what I would say to echo Stephen is that, as I mentioned earlier, it's okay if we examine when we notice that sometimes our intentions are mixed. We're not looking for perfection, but in the context of a school and being an educator, one knows they're ready once they've spent time with the practice for themselves. And they've spent time with mindful teaching, that awareness that comes with reflective teaching, that knows that how your own practice has been impactful in the way you are with your kids in the room. What happened in that moment when there was resistance? Because it doesn't only happen with say teaching mindfulness, you know, children will push back because that's just developmentally what they're supposed to do. And also maybe a North Star would be when you don't see mindfulness as something to have children be more still.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, we have 5 more minutes for the conference, and thank both of you very much. We would like to end with a short meditation, and Kelly, maybe because the connection, the quality of the connection with you is better than the connection with Stephen, maybe you could lead us for like 3-4 minutes of meditation. Are you okay with that?
Sure, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So whatever feels comfortable, with your eyes open or your eyes closed, see if you can get in touch with where the practice wants to show itself to you now. So where in your body are you listening from? Where do you feel sensation in your body? Where are you connecting? And see if you can invite presence in your heart. Notice how your heart feels now without judgment. In our practice today, we'll invite compassion. So see if for a moment that you can imagine somebody in your life who's really easy to love. And as you have that person in your mind, see if you can send these wishes to that person. May you feel safe. May you feel happy. May you feel healthy. And may you live with ease. And see if you can imagine that person feeling your wishes. And now see if you can imagine someone who might be just a tiny bit difficult. Like it could be someone you know in your family or a friend who maybe is a tiny bit, maybe even like annoying sometimes. And if you can imagine them. And see if you can send these kind wishes to this person. Just start by noticing what it feels like to imagine them in your mind, in your heart. May you be safe. May you be happy. May you be healthy. May you live with ease. And noticing what it feels like to send these wishes, imagining they land with your person. And now lastly, imagining that you could see yourself in a mirror. And sending these wishes to yourself. Noticing what it feels like to imagine yourself and see yourself reflected back in the mirror. May I feel safe. May I feel happy. May I feel healthy. May I live with ease. Noticing what it feels like in your heart to send these kind wishes to yourself. And one last sending of wishes to the group in this call, the group in this meeting. May we all here feel safety together. Safety. May we feel healthy. Healthy. May we feel happy. Happy. May we live with ease. Ease. May all beings everywhere feel safe, healthy, happy, and free. Thank you.
I just want to say that I feel privileged to have you all in my room for this 2 hour. I think it's incredible. Thank you very much, and to be continued. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Miki.
Shalom from Israel.
Shalom.
Thank you, everybody, participants. Thank you, Miki, for organizing this and all the others. It's beautiful. It was a beautiful gathering. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Amir, Janina.